Hi everyone, and welcome to the Belarusian Canadian Alliance webinar. The topic of our discussion today is Catastrophe and Denial in Belarus, 35 years after the Chernobyl disaster. My name is Natalia Smalyuk. I'm a media advisor to the Belarusian Canadian Alliance in Toronto. I have the honor of moderating this conversation today. We're here to remember the victims of the Chernobyl disaster. Many of us in this webinar vividly remember this day 35 years ago. We'll also talk about the way the official Minsk deals with crisis, reflect on the legacy of Chernobyl in today's Belarus, talk about Astrovets, a new nuclear energy facility in Belarus, and touch on the protest movement in the country where historically large crowds gather for Chernobylsky Shlях, which in English means the Chernobyl way. As some people are still arriving and getting settled, I'll go through a couple of housekeeping notes before introducing our guests in just a couple of moments. The format of our discussion is a panel. Please feel free to send questions through the Q&A chat or YouTube comments. Depending on the number of questions we get and how much time we have at the end, we'll try to take as many questions as we can, but it will really depend on our timing. Now, something important. Around 1:55 Eastern Time, or 5 minutes before the end of the webinar, we'll have a minute of silence to remember the victims of Chernobyl. We'd also like to take a picture at that time. So for those of you who are comfortable to do so, please feel free to turn your videos on again around 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. And we'd also like to share that image on social media and with our friends in Belarus. And now I'm excited to introduce our three guests. David Marples joining us from Edmonton in Alberta. David is a distinguished professor with the Department of History and Classics, University of Alberta. He is a regular commentator on Belarus and author of 16 single-authored books and 4 edited books on topics ranging from contemporary Belarus and Ukraine to the Chernobyl disaster to Stalinism. The name of today's webinar actually came from one of his publications. Veronika Laputska is joining from Canary Islands today. Veronika is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Social Research, Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, and a co-founder and research fellow at the East Center. Veronika's focus is on media analysis, propaganda tools, and democratization in Eastern and Central Europe. And Andrei Zharovsky is joining us from close to Moscow in Russia. Andrei is a physicist, publicist, and critic of nuclear energy. He's also an activist in the Belarusian anti-nuclear campaign. Andrei was twice arrested in Belarus for participating in the opposition to the construction of the nuclear power plant, Astrovets. And now, without further ado, let's start our conversation. And my first question is going to be for David. David, in late April 1986, explosions at the Chernobyl nuclear power station contaminated large parts of what was then known as the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. In 1996, you wrote a book called Belarus, From Soviet Rule to Nuclear Catastrophe. So my first question for you, David, is why Belarus? I know your PhD dissertation was on Ukraine. So curious, what was the story behind writing this book? So David, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to see everyone here. Yeah, back in that period, I hadn't been to Belarus at the time of Chernobyl disaster and the first 5 years after the Chernobyl disaster. But in 1991, I was attending a conference in Washington, D.C. on the 5th anniversary of Chernobyl, which was about Ukraine. But there were some Belarusians holding a conference in the same hotel. And I started talking to them, and they asked me why in my books I never talked about Belarus. And they invited me to a conference in Minsk the following April. And this was a group called Children of Chernobyl, which was run by the late Gennady Khrushchev, or Henad Khrushchev, and included a number of fairly prominent scientists who were working on Chernobyl. And that's really where I started. And I started coming to Belarus on a regular basis after that. And the book covered not only Chernobyl and its impact on Belarus, but actually Belarusian history, because my feeling was there was simply not enough on the history of Belarus for the Western observer in order to give them some kind of perspective. In other words, I couldn't just start with Chernobyl and work from there. I had to go back in time and explain where we got to by 1995, 1996, which was a pivotal period, as you know, in Belarus. It was the time of the first presidential election, the Belarusian constitution, and the emergence of Lukashenko as the first president of Belarus. And of course, despite this passage of time, the president has not actually gone away. He's still there. So that's how it started. And I've continued since then looking at politics and history, most recently with Veronica herself, but also mostly on my own up to that point.
Well, thank you, David, for sharing how it all started and the story behind the book. Now, can you tell us about your observations on the social impact of Chernobyl then at the time of you writing the book or getting engaged with Belarus, and now 35 years after the Chernobyl disaster?
Well, Chernobyl had a profound impact on Belarus, but it's a disaster that was largely ignored by the post-Soviet authorities after 1994. And the conference that I was mentioning continued having different conferences in future years. And I remember it became harder and harder for that group to operate and for the conferences to be held. Lukashenko declared that Chernobyl as a disaster was over, it had been overcome, and that there were no further dangers to the population. And yet it was fairly evident by 1991, 1992, 3, that illnesses were fairly rampant, especially thyroid gland cancer among children, which had never been seen up to that point. And other forms of illness as well. The general level of morbidity went up. The number of sick children in Belarus in areas that were contaminated compared with clean areas was considerably notable. Even in the hospitals, there were some diseases that hadn't been seen among children before that were now being seen for the first time. And so there was a kind of parallel between what the authorities were saying and what was actually happening in Belarusian society. The situation got worse after the Soviet period, ironically, because in the Soviet period, the entire operation operated from Moscow was dealing with it. But once it devolved simply to Belarus, then the amount of investment being put into health considerably decreased. So Chernobyl became more of a catastrophe, I think, in the post-Soviet period than before. The most contaminated areas were in the east, southeast, and towards Brest. But if you look at radioactive iodine, it virtually covered all of Belarus, and that proved to be one of the chief health problems afterward. So that was my initial impression 30 years ago. It's not changed a lot today. Chernobyl is still a big problem in Belarus. It's been overshadowed by political events, but that doesn't detract from its importance today. And I'm sure this group here will emphasize more as we continue.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, David, for this observations about the gap between the official response to the Chernobyl disaster. And it's interesting that the message was that Chernobyl is over and the reality of what is actually happening. At this point, we'll go to another part of the conversation before we come back to the issue of Chernobyl. And my next question is going to be for Andrei. 35 years after Chernobyl, we have another nuclear facility in Belarus, the Astrovets nuclear power plant that came online in November 2020 with one reactor. The second reactor is still under construction. Now, building a nuclear power plant in the country that was worst affected by Chernobyl certainly raised some eyebrows. From the official point of view, the new plant was needed to offset dependence on the Russian oil and gas. But given that Belarus didn't have the technology or the resources to build the plant, it had to rely on the Russian funding and reactors to actually build it, something that was not broadly shared in Belarus. Andrew, I know you have the slides, which we are going to try to put up on the screen. And in speaking with you, we'd really be interested to know in your assessment of whether Astrovets is dangerous and what is your assessment of the threat levels that are available. Andrei, over to you. Hopefully we can start sharing the slides.
Well, let me first comment. Of course, each and every nuclear power plant is dangerous. That's a physical reality, and of course, there is a kind of propaganda reality. So if you come to any website of any nuclear power plant in Russia and Canada, I'm sure you will find that they say they are like main pillars of sustainable development and they help to fight poverty and many other things, which is not actually true. But let me really start with some very general remarks about the technical part of the nuclear power plant. So you are right. That is a new Russian reactor type called VVR 1200, and it looks like French reactors of 20 years ago. Why and how dangerous is this nuclear power plant? Let me quote. I want really to start with a very basic physical reality that the pressure water reactors, the main safety feature is the reactor vessel. So the hot water with a huge power is held in the steel vessel of the reactor, and in case of any incident, the temperature rise and pressure rise, and means that the vessel and the pipes can be damaged. That is a quotation, well, my very free translation, from a former minister of nuclear energy of Russia. He told it in the interview of 1998. So the very physics of this type of reactor does not allow to call it really safe. There is no safe nuclear energy based on the water cooling reactors. Vitaly Subbotin, the member of Russian Academy of Science, wrote in a book in '94. So each and every nuclear power plant is dangerous, and the Astrovets nuclear power plant is also an example of the really huge propaganda efforts of showing that as if it is a good stuff. This picture, I took it from official environmental impact assessment. There were public hearings long ago. I even don't remember exactly which year, 2010 or 2011. And at public hearings, they show the document with this picture, and you can see B747 definitely written, and everyone who can see this picture can read that it's so cool reactor dome, so the cool containment that it can stand against the big airplane impact, which is not true. Later we find official reply of the Belarusian nuclear authorities to Lithuania, and they say no. The containment can stand only against the plane mass not more than 5.7 tons. 5.7 tons is a really small Cessna plane. So that's one of examples. First, they really show that yes, we have a containment which is brand new for Russia, by the way. We have much smaller and softer containments. Now they built in Belarus, and it looks like kind of strange stuff. Core catcher. Core catcher is a device which is placed under the reactor to come to hold the malted stuff in it. The core catcher is common for European nuclear power plants since 70s, and that it was one of the first Russian-made core catchers. And if you can see, it was very strange. The European core catchers, they try to put the core in a very plain way, as if it put it on a plate to have air cool it and not to allow nuclear reaction to be in. If you look at this device, well, you can have questions. You can have questions why they want to put core in one small vessel, why they are sure that it works. No one can test it in practice. No one will melt a reactor to test if it works or not. So this first part of my message is all these modern features of the Russian-built reactors. Well, maybe they are good, maybe not. We cannot judge. That diagram is the flow of radioactive and nuclear waste. First, the nuclear power plant will emit gaseous radioactive waste, as each and every nuclear power plant does, which is most dangerous in Belarus, where population was already faced the radiation impact from Chernobyl. So this may be small, maybe not so huge additional emissions, they can have a really huge impact on the health. What about the solid waste? What about spent nuclear fuel? No solution. No solution. No treaty with Russia. They promised to send spent nuclear fuel to Russia for reprocessing. It doesn't work. We still don't have any treaty on that, so it's quite likely that the spent nuclear fuel will stay in Belarus. Other type of solid waste, no solution at all. Last week, the Belarusian authorities say that they will build something. No ideas what will be that something, what size, what type of repository, how the quality of construction. Maybe you know that that there was a really unique in the world practice situation when the vessel was damaged. It was falling down from 4 meters or even more high when they tried to put it on place. So quality of construction is another issue. Not only quality of the project itself, but of the construction. And the second vessel, which was sent from Russia to replace the first one, was also there was an impact to the railway pillars during the transportation. Maybe this small horns of the vessel were also damaged. We don't know. The Russian turbine is not really good, and in the first nuclear power plant of this project inside Russia, it was shortcut on this 1 week on the full capacity. In Belarus, maybe you know, when Lukashenko started in November, second day it was down because of the fire and the transformators. So that was just a signals how specific danger is a nuclear power plant built by Rosatom, the Russian Federation State Corporation Nuclear Energy. And my last portion of video materials is I want to share with you these flex risk maps. That's Austrian research made for European nuclear power plants, but they also made calculations for several other, including Russia and Belarus, nuclear power plants. So they just want to calculate what is the possible worst case scenario if we take the modern reactors. So this map shows one of the possible scenarios where can you help me? It's not Minsk, but all the north of Belarus can be polluted. If you see down to the numbers, this pink color means evacuation. The pink color means evacuation of people in the distance of up to 200 kilometers from the nuclear power plant, which is exactly like happened in Chernobyl. I remind you that the Chernobyl is not limited with 30 kilometers, it's 100 kilometers. Well, another wind conditions, and we say farewell to Lithuania. That's why Lithuania is really against this project, because you see the country can be really crossed by the evacuation zone, which is which is not so good. Yeah, well, I told you about the pink color, and yellow and red means problems for agriculture. So the real impact, the real size of the problems in case of the most heavy incident is really higher. So how they overcome that? Again, I quote the official environmental impact assessment stuff. So that is what Belarus wants us to believe, that no more than 3,000 meters problems for agriculture, 600 meters evacuation zone. That is kind of bullshit, because for the same type of reactor, when Russia wants to build it in Finland, maybe you know Finland doesn't give the license yet, they're smart. The same three circles are 100 kilometers, 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. Again, the Rosatom lies, saying 600 meters, 800 meters, and 3 kilometers. In reality, you have hundreds of kilometers of the possible impact zone. So that's why we really say that the nuclear power plant is something to be stopped. Unfortunately, it's already built. So what to do? But in reality, it is constructed, but it's not yet officially inaugurated. It's not yet officially it was not commissioned yet. So on the 30th, at the end of the week, on 30th of April, there will be public hearings, and we can try to take part from remote countries as well, because it's they want to have it in a combined mode, where people technically can say no. I don't believe that it is reality. Neither in Russia nor in Belarus, people cannot stop big nuclear projects, but at least public hearings is a good momentum to express our concern and maybe to express our anger. We try to do something with the Belarusian anti-nuclear campaign, but we'll see what will be our opportunities, and we'll let to take part in these hearings.
Well, thank you very much, Andrei, for this very comprehensive discussion. And I'm glad we were able to see the visuals, and thank you for the summaries in English for those members of our audience who are English speaking, who don't speak Russian or Belarusian. Certainly there was a lot of technical information in there, and complex charts, and I can see that people are already asking questions, which we will try to tackle in our discussion part of the conversation later. But I will go to one of them, and that question at this point, and that question is, what is the level of radiation today, and are people still developing illnesses? So that's one of the questions we got from the audience. Andrei, can you hear me?
Oh, the questions are to me. Good. Unfortunately, I do not go deeper in the Belarusian case, but in Russia, we still have a huge territories. Officially, 1.5 million of people in my country, in Russia, live in a situation of contamination. That was the figure was published by the ministry 2 or 3 years ago. So we have Chernobyl here, and the soil, in the food. In Belarus, if I remember correctly, the far remote areas in Mogilov Oblast are not yet open, are not yet the same as in the Bryansk area, Novozybkov, in part of Russia. So we still have exclusion zones where people cannot live, where there is no agriculture possible. We have plus a lot of territory covered. The figures are, I cannot remember it by heart, but again, they are higher than official permit. So Chernobyl is still there. But may I comment also? I have seen, I missed that the question, or that modern nuclear power plants are much better than Chernobyl. Well, yes, they are much better. They are different. And they have hundreds of different ways to repeat a radiation disaster, not exactly like in Chernobyl, but in very different ways. If you go to any nuclear discussion, you can see the steam generation failure, early containment failure, pressure vessel failure, a lot of scenarios written by engineers and confirmed by the way, by IAEA as well, by any specialist in the world can confirm that there are scenarios in these modern reactors with double containment with core catcher, so they do not give 100% guarantee. Why we need 100%? Because the size of disaster. Any other installation, whatever, windmill or gas power plant, if something goes wrong, the disaster was very short on time and short on territory. For Chernobyl, for Ostrovets, we are talking about that. It's 100 kilometers in area and 100 years in time. So that's basically why well, my opinion, I think that the Ostrovets is not appropriate. It should not be accepted at all. Well, if we forget, just let me tell one more thing. Even if we forget about the disaster, the energy of Belarus nuclear power plant will be so expensive that if now already they rise the electrical price, they cannot find enough consumers. That's very funny. Remember when a decision was taken in 2008, 2011, when they expect the rise of economy and maybe new factories, new consumers. Now they don't have consumers. And the Belarusian government make an obligation for the enterprises to rise consumption of energy. It's unbelievable. So what shall they do? Shall they buy back this old type of lighting? So how to rise consumption if you are already on the good mode of energy saving? So the energy is not needed. Energy is expensive, and nuclear power plant is dangerous, and no way to solve the problem of radioactive waste. Again, if we even forget about all that, one problem of the spent nuclear fuel and the radioactive waste can kill the project. If Belarusian government would like to have a really genuine discussion that time, they can let us speak. They can easily let us speak. Maybe I can mention one more thing. The first, the nuclear projects, they come and go, and when they did it, first attempt to rise a new nuclear ambition of Belarus in 90s, the government they call for expert commission, and the experts come together and say no. They don't say no forever. They say no, not in the next 10 years. And we had 10 years moratorium in Belarus for any discussion of nuclear power plants, which was ended in 2011. So this time there was no commission, no discussion. The public hearings, they arrest me just because I want to criticize the nuclear power plant. So that's how dangerous and wrong decisions are taken in a situation of autocracy. Can I use this word?
Oh,
So basically, that is bad project. I can go deeper into details, but I hope that everyone can find more and more information about this specific Rosatom type of reactors. So they have all the problems of each and every reactor in the world, and no good reactors in the world exist.
well, thank you, Andrei. It's a big topic, and we'll try to go back to this conversation if we have time in the open discussion part of the webinar. And at this point, I'd like to go back to the topic of the official Belarusian response to disasters and touch on a couple of crisis events in our recent memory. As Soviet Belarusia, Belarus faced another catastrophe, Stalin's mass executions from 1937 to 1941 at the Kuropaty forest in Minsk and other locations. We know that to the north of Minsk, about 30,000 victims, 30,000 of people victims of the NKVD are buried in the Kurapate forest, and NKVD later became known as the KGB. Moving on to the present time, in 2020 and 2021, we now have COVID, which was dismissed by Alexander Lukashenko as a psychosis that can be fought off with vodka and visits to a banya or sauna. So it appears that the official response to all of these tragedies has been somewhat similar to Chernobyl, which is ignore, dismiss, and forget. So I'd like to take this discussion to Veronika and then David. Veronika, my question for you, is denial a uniquely Belarusian response to disasters?
Thank you very much, Natalia, for questions. And I would also like to thank Belarusian Canadian Alliance and Belarusian Diaspora in Canada for organizing this very important event on such an important issue, which unfortunately tends to be forgotten in our world full of news and pandemic and all these problems we are facing these days. I think that there's a habit of denial. This culture of denial is a very characteristic, or is like a very crucial feature for all regimes which are authoritarian or totalitarian. So where there is this huge gap between the government and the elites and people, and elites tend to take care of only about themselves, as it was in the Soviet Union and as it was when Chernobyl disaster took place, when the general population wasn't informed on time and when it wasn't evacuated. However, Communist Party elites were evacuated, and the families were informed about this, and we know that there was a 1st of May demonstration in 1986, and all of them were wearing hats and even gloves sometimes, and all people were looking at them and wondering. And these people, who were witnessing all this, they're still alive, all the generations, and people still remember how it was. And of course, when we speak about Belarusian authoritarian regime, which demonstrates a lot of features very similar to Soviet regime, and also taking an example from them and not even hiding this. In many ways, it's no surprise that similar reaction appears after big catastrophes take place and after such unfortunate discoveries happen. Together with Professor Makros, we've been working during the last several years on this memorialization of these extermination sites in Belarus, and we saw, unfortunately, many places which are not just like Kurapate, but also those which are situated in the north of Belarus or in east of Belarus, in Mohyliv Oblast, in Vitebsk Oblast. And we know that these sites still are there, and since 1991, when Belarus became independent, nothing has really been done in this regard to discover officially, openly what was happening there. And of course, there is no wonder that there is still a lot of conspiracy and secrecy on what is happening in Ostrovets, and what are also the consequences of Chernobyl, whether they're still there. Together again with Professor Marcos, when we were during one of our last visits, I think 2 years ago, we were talking to our friends in Belarus who were saying that they noticed that a lot of landmarks which previously had been situated along different roads, marking that these are contaminated areas, simply have been removed for some reason. And people still remember that they had been there. So it's like there is this whole procedure of pretending as if contamination is still not there, and also bringing back this agricultural soil and these fields to proper usage without proper assessment. But once again, it all deals with their main problem of the regime, which is very much distant from the population, and we can see it by the reaction to their recent protests after the presidential elections 2020, when the authorities, they just don't want to hear the people, what they ask for, and they want to take care of them, and they only want to preserve their own interests and their own rule. And unfortunately, in my opinion, as long as the regime has this very features, so this habit of denial of not following up with catastrophes, it will remain. And it's a very complicated issue also because we know that Astrovets has a lot to do with also Russia's interest and Chinese interested in Belarus, and this all has become also, of course, a political game for Lukashenko and for the elites. So it is really important we talk about this and we still look at this and how it's happening. And I will pass, I think, over to David. Perhaps, David, do you have anything to add? Thank you.
That was a pretty good summary, I think. I would probably just mention that Lukashenko has tried to build a Belarusian national identity today on the Second World War, or Great Patriotic War, and the victory in the Great Patriotic War, so that wherever you go in Belarus, you can see memorials, monuments, museums dedicated to the Second World War. And as a result of that, there's been very little focus on the crimes of Stalin. By comparison, say, with Ukraine, which exposed them back in the late 1980s. And this has not happened at all in Belarus, which is why these mass graves remained, well, they were detected from 2014 onwards, but from 1994 to 2014, very little was done in order to expose these elements of the past because they contradicted official narrative. And this narrative, of course, you might argue that after all this time, it will simply run out by itself. People have already lost memories of the Second World War, and you have very few veterans now from the Second World War who are still alive today. So I think that is one way. And this national identity has been called a soft form of Belarusian nationalism in order to distinguish Belarus from Russia and to step a different path toward Russia, that is away from Russia, but also away from the European Union, and form this independent path. After COVID, I think the situation changed quite dramatically because for the first time in many years, the population decided to act by itself without taking any kind of orders from above. And in cities such as Minsk, there were individual initiatives adopted to respond to COVID, giving medical equipment for doctors, contributing money to different forms of help to people suffering from COVID-19. I personally know one doctor who invented her own COVID test because she couldn't get the official one. And I think this has been a very positive development, that Belarusians have realized that they cannot rely on help from above. And when the little Batka at the top is not really providing for society anymore, his social contract with the population is broken. And that has made the situation very different today from earlier periods in Belarus. So the denial has continued. I think that's the element that we've highlighted here, catastrophe followed by denial. That happened again in 2020, but this time there was a response from below. The grassroots responded. And I think this will help in future developments as well. Perhaps if there's a little time later, I will expand on that.
Well, thank you, Veronica and David, for your excellent analysis of what appears to be a strategy of denial of the official Minsk in its crisis management approach, as well as a selective treatment of the crisis that the official Minsk can draw on in its construction of the national narrative. Veronica touched on the protests that started in August, almost a year ago, or less than a year ago, and I wanted to develop that topic a little more. Well, arguably, Belarusians participated in the largest protests in Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Lukashenko blamed the unrest on the criminals, drug addicts, and unemployed, manipulated by Western puppeteers. And again, a side note here, it sounds like we again seem to have a case of denial here as well. in the second half of 2020, when these large crowds went into the streets, it looked like the fear disappeared for a period of time. But after the winter months, it feels like the fear factor came back. Lukashenko may have lost the bond he once may have had with the public, but he still has the tools to stay in power. Veronica, maybe I'll address this question to you as well. Again, is there anything that gives you hope in this situation?
Thank you, Natalia, for this great question. I would pick up to what Professor Marples was saying about last year. I think last year was indeed a turning point when Belarusians elaborated a proper answer to a catastrophe and to this habit of denial of a catastrophe, which was happening during COVID-19 pandemic beginning, and then it continued throughout the year. This feeling of solidarity, of brotherhood, sisterhood, of support, and of belief. I think, and I also think it's great, and you're correctly, Natalia, comparing this to protests when the Berlin Wall fell, when people were so fed up with all these lies which were surrounded them, of course, topping up on the with the economic crisis and other problems societies were facing. I think it was a very similar mood in Belarus last year when all these protests erupted, and Belarusians remain very much self-organized until now because the pandemic continues. It is doubled, the crisis doubled by their problems connected with the violence and with the mass scale of repressions, which a lot of active citizens are facing. And now we know that they cover all ages, all genders, it doesn't matter the social status of people, because we know that prominent sportsmen have been in jail, and Miss Belarus 2008 was in jail, and there is no time to even list, I don't know, 1/10 of this prominent people who have already been through this violence and repression machine. So this made people got connected, and also I think that what the Belarusian regime doesn't realize is that the times have changed now, and they're very much different even to those times which were like a turning point for Eastern Europe and for Germany in 1989, 1988. Because now we have social media, we have the internet, and we have modern technology, which you cannot really get hold of, and one cannot simply stop letting people communicate to each other and self-organize themselves in numerous chats on Telegram or WhatsApp or Viber, or people are taking photos and quickly passing to each other what is happening, wherever is their right police is coming, and how to get how to hide from them in some districts of Minsk or other cities or towns. So through these digital media tools, people get very much united, and even those people who these days do not protest, they feel this energy of participation and of engagement into these processes by simply reposting what is happening, or simply conveying these messages to people who live abroad. Also, as you know, like the best diasporas have very much blossomed and activated their deeds all over the world, really. So this kind of is going on, and it's unstoppable, as well as both Belarusian diasporas and people who still remain in Belarus informing the outer world of what is happening. And I think this is something the regime is now trying to kind of take into consideration by creating pro-government influencers on social media, or by using harsher and harsher propaganda on TV or on traditional media, but it's obvious that they do not have enough resources, and even if they do, and even if they attract journalists from Russia today or from some other external countries who can support them in their effort, it's still the scale of what is happening in terms of this digital space, it just unbeatable for them. So this gives me hope. But on the other hand, of course, I think we all should be very realistic about the shortages of this protest, which now kind of is a little bit underground. And of course, we should be realistic still about all these tools which the regime possesses, like army and like KGB services, Russia support. So of course, we shouldn't be naive, in my opinion, in terms of understanding that this fight will be, I think, a long term, as opposed to what was happening during Berlin Wall fell, or the spring in Central Europe in 1989. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronika. The situation certainly continues to be very, very difficult, but it's great that you're saying that times have changed, the context is different, and a huge part of that different context is a completely different digital and media environment that we operate in. And here I would like to go back to David, and David, ask you about your thoughts on potential scenarios of how the situation may develop from here in the long or short term.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, of course, and anything I say could make me look like an idiot within a year or so. But I see there are certain potential directions that could be taken, at least three possible ways forward. And I'll preface that by saying the statement by Lukashenko the other day that if he was shot, then power would pass to the security forces, I think was a very significant statement, because not only is that contravening the Belarusian constitution, even the amended one, which is that power would go to the parliament next and to the chairman of the parliament. It's changed that, but it also symbolizes what's happened in Belarus today, where you've got a president with diminished powers, diminished popularity, who is now relying heavily on the security forces and a foreign power to stay in office against the wishes of his people, who actually did not elect him as president last year. The security forces have got immense power today in Belarus, and you could almost say that it's reached a state of martial law. And to follow Veronika's analogy with Poland in the 1980s, solidarity, we're probably at 1981 or 1982, they took power much later in the 1980s. I'm not saying that Belarus would go on that long in this kind of situation, because I think it's impossible to maintain. But the other factor is the economy. How long can the economy sustain at the present time, relying on loans now almost exclusively from Russia, relying on Russia's aid with security, relying on Russian media to run its own TV channels, and in a military security alliance with Russia, which is in a conflict situation at the same time with Ukraine. All this makes for a very difficult situation, and it reduces Lukashenko's room for maneuver, especially in terms of his foreign policy. He cannot sort of squeeze his way now between the European Union and Russia. He has committed himself to the Russian Federation, and he's committed his foreign policy to be along the same lines as laid out by Russia, which has never happened before in a quarter of a century or more of Lukashenko's leadership. So that is his situation. And in terms of the Belarusian population, the latest poll that I saw from Chatham House, which is probably about as accurate as you will get, even though there are problems with it, suggests that about 25% of Belarus's population are active opponents of Lukashenko today. That is the sort of people who will go out in the streets and protest. But you've got another 30% that is anti-Lukashenko, but is not willing to say lose jobs or give up student positions at universities, understandably, of course, because these are people's livelihoods and they don't want to give them up. But that is where I think the die would be cast if there was a general strike against the government, in the knowledge that there would be some help to these people if they were subsequently unemployed or arrested or detained, etc. And I think it's a dangerous situation for that reason. It helps Lukashenko hang on a little longer. I don't think that Belarusians can resort to violence. They've been very peaceful in these demonstrations, and that I think has been the value of them. It's almost like a depiction of good and evil, the riot troops against the demonstrators, where you see people just being attacked on the streets, defenseless, completely innocent, and put into these vans and then taken off to detention camps. And it reminds me of, one of the Latin American dictatorships at its worst times. And this is where we are with Belarus today. And it could go on a little longer unless there are changes coming, or if Russia decides to abandon Lukashenko, which is not inconceivable. I mean, why do they want to prop him up indefinitely if he's not going to agree to, say, a Russian Air Force base in Belarus, or more military maneuvers, or even a potential joint attack on Ukrainian forces? All these things, I think, are tied in together now, and that's what's made it much more complex. And the main leadership of Belarus is outside Belarus, right? The one who took part in the election is outside Belarus or in jail. There's an enormous number of political prisoners today in Belarus, an unprecedented number. Virtually every leader of every major opposition party is in jail or abroad today. They're not allowed to operate within the country. This all gives Lukashenko more time than we thought that he may have had last August.
Thank you, David. Thank you for this three scenarios and multiple scenarios and possibilities within each of them as things continue to be very dynamic. And this also is an appropriate time for us to start wrapping up the panel discussion part of our conversation. I'm doing a time check here. I realize we only have 7 minutes and we still have one more element that we wanted to do in our webinar today. So I am looking at the questions from the audience, and we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. So I'll go back to Andrei. And Andrei, the question that we'd like to ask you is, what do you recommend to diasporas who want to express their opposition to Ostrovets? Other international organizations they can write to? So Andrei, back to you.
Well, the first, it's very simple to be vocal, to be seen basically in the country where you are. If you try to inform Canadian civil society about the problems, maybe that helps. It's not direct. And of course, you, as a Belarusian citizen, so former Belarusian citizens, you can join our campaign. The Belarusian anti-nuclear campaign needs you. We are quite few people keep saying that nuclear power plant in Ostrovets is dangerous. We were doing that since 2008. And we have quite a big piece of texts. We have the public environmental impact assessment made by 2 members of Academy of Science, one from Belarus, one from Russia. Why not to take that and use it to reach general public in your country and back in Belarus? I cannot, I cannot now plan the public campaign. The campaign is something which is done by one webinar. But why not to join? Why not to keep communication? And I'm happy that you invite me, as unfortunately my friends in Minsk now are in big trouble. I just come to your stream from a Belarusian stream, and one of participants from Belarusian Green Party was out of the web conversation because police came to his office. So the police just taken the office of Belarusian Green Party. Why not to make this information available outside Belarus? It can be good. criticizing the nuclear power plant, of course, you cannot avoid the question which I have seen somewhere in the chat. Are you against this specific nuclear power plant, or you don't want any? I can reply about myself. Of course, I don't like any nuclear power plant because I'm trained as a nuclear physicist. I graduated in the nuclear physics. I understand how poor is that technology. You can take softer position. You can criticize Ostrovets because it's next to Vilnius, next to the capital of other country. It's in the place where there was a huge Gudagai earthquake back in 1909, if I remember correctly. So there are many ways to criticize this project, and of course, it's not okay. Let me not comment on the political part of that, but I think that Russia decided to give money to Rosatom to build this nuclear power plant on purpose. They really want the high tension between Lithuania and Belarus. And it's quite likely that it was Russia who said, build it next to Vilnius. Just do that and we will give you $10 billion as a state export credit. So there is a huge political games behind that. But even without that, nuclear power is dangerous.
Thank you, Andy. I feel like we might need another webinar conversation to continue touching on all the important aspects of this issue. But our time is almost up. We have 3 more minutes. So I'd like to thank you, all of our panelists. It was a great discussion. Thank you very much for keeping the spotlight on Belarus. And I hope we can think about the future with some optimism, but we should also try to learn from the past, and we should definitely not forget the past. So that's why we'd like to end this webinar with a minute of silence to remember the victims of Chernobyl. As a reminder, we'll also be taking a picture at this time. So for those of you who are comfortable to turn your camera on, please feel free to do so. And at this point, we'll go silent for 1 minute. Okay, well, thank you everyone again who joined us today. A huge shout out to Alena Livonchenko, the president of the Belarusian Canadian Alliance, and Katya Reisberg, a media advisor to the Alliance, who made this event happen. And thanks a million to our guests, David, Veronica, Andrei. And that concludes our webinar, Живе Belarus. And for those who would like to stay just a little longer, we'll have the video on if you have a couple of minutes, but I will say bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And we have our group picture. And as a last minute surprise, we have a video prepared by Belarusian Institute of Arts and Sciences in Canada, which will now start. And thank you again, everyone, for attending and being with us today. Живе Belarus.
Живе.
Живе Беларусь.
Живе.
Живе.
Живе Беларусь.
Дзіцячы хор. Алёша Бельскі, 9 гадоў, Аня Богуш, 10 гадоў, Наташа Дварэцкая, 16, Лена Жадро, 15, Юра Жук, 15, Оля Звонак, 10 гадоў, Снежана Зіневіч, 16, Іра Кудрачова, 14 гадоў, Юля Каско, 11 гадоў, Ваня Коваров, 12, Вадим Красносолнышт, 9 гадоў, Вася Мікуліч, 15, Антон Нашиванкін, 14, Марат Татарцаў, 16 гадоў, Юлія Тараскіна, 15 гадоў, Катя Шаўчук, 14 гадоў, Барыс Шкірманкоў, 16 гадоў. Я ляжала в больнице, мне было так болюче. Я просила маму: «Мамочка, я не могу трываць, лепш забі мяне». Такая чорная хмара, такі ливень. Лужины стали жоўтыя, зялёныя, быццам мы іх налілі фарбы. Гаварылі, што гэта кветкавы пылок. Мы не бегалі па лужынах, толькі глядзелі на іх. Бабуля зачыняла нас у пограбе, а сама ўкленчвала і малілася. І нас вучыла. Маліцеся, гэта канец свету. Кара боская за нашы грахі. Братику было 8 гадоў, а мне 6. Мы сталі ўспамінаць свае грахі. І ён разбіў слоік з малінавым варэннем. А я не прызналася маме, што зачапілася за плот і парвала новую сукенку. Схавала ў шафе. Мама часта апранае чорную хустку. На нашай вуліцы увесь час некага хаваюць. Пачую музыку, бягу дадому і малюся. Чытаю «Ойче наш». Малюся за маму і тату. Па нас прыехалі салдаты на машынах. Я падумаў, што пачалася вайна. Яны выдумлялі незразумелыя словы: дэзактывацыя, ізатопы. У дарозе прысніўся сон, адбыўся выбух, а я жывы. Няма хаты, няма бацькоў, няма нават раб'ёў і варон. У жаху прачынаюся, падхопліваюся, глядзеў у акно. Ці няма ў небе гэтага грыба кашмарнага. Памятаю, як салдат ганяўся за кошкай. На кошцы дазіметр працаваў як аўтамат, шчоўк-шчоўк. За ёй хлопчык і дзяўчынка. Гэта іхняя кошка. Хлопчык дык нічога, а дзяўчына крычала: «Не аддам!» Бегала і крычала: «Міленькая, уцякай, уцякай, міленькая!» А салдат з вялікім цэлафанавым мехам. У хаце мы пакінулі, зачынілі майго хамячка, беленькага. На 2 дні яму яе ж пакінулі, а з'ехалі назаўсёды. Загрузілі нас у эшалон. Малыя плачуць, выпацкаліся. Адна выхавацелька на 20 чалавек. А ўсе плачуць: «Мама, дзе мама? Хачу дамоў». Мне 10 гадоў. Такія дзяўчынкі, як я, памагалі супакойваць малых. Жанчыны сустракалі нас на перонах і хрысцілі цягнік. Неслі свае печыва, малако, цёплую бульбу. Нас везлі ў Ленінградскую вобласць. Там ужо, як пад'язджалі да станцый, людзі хрысціліся і глядзелі здалёк. Баяліся нашага цягніка. На кожнай станцыі яго доўга мылі. Калі на адным прыпынку мы выскачылі з вагона і забеглі ў буфет. Нікога туды больш не пусцілі. Тут чарнобыльскія дзеці ядуць марожанае. Буфетчыца некаму па тэлефоне гаварыла. Яны паядуць, мы памыем з хлоркай падлогу і пракіпяцім шклянкі. Мы чулі. Сустракалі нас урачы. Яны былі ў процівагазах і гумавых пельчатках. Забралі ў нас вопратку, усе рэчы, нават канверты, галоўкі і ручкі, склалі ў цэлефанавыя пакеты і закапалі ў лесе. Мы моцна напалохаліся. Доўга пасля чакалі, як пачнем паміраць. Мама з татам пацалаваліся, і я нарадзілася. Раней я думала, што ніколі не памру, а цяпер ведаю, што памру. Хлопчык ляжаў разам са мной у бальніцы. Вадзік Карынкоў. Птушачак мне маляваў, домікі ён памёр. Паміраць не страшна, будзеш доўга-доўга спаць і ніколі не прачнешся. Мне сніўся сон, як я памерла. Чула ў сне, як плакала моя мама, і я прачнулася. Хачу расказаць, як развітвалася з нашай хатай моя бабуля. Яна парасіла тату вынесці з кладоўкі мех проса і рассыпала яго па садзе божым птушачкам. Сабрала ў рэшата яйкі і высыпала ў двары нашаму кату і сабаку. Накрышыла ім сала. Павытрэсвала з усіх сваіх мяшэчкаў насенне морквы, гарбузоў, агуркоў, цыбулі, чарнушкі, розных кветак. Рассыпала па агародзе. Хай у зямлі жывуць. А пасля пакланілася хаце, пакланілася хлеву, абышла і пакланілася кожнай яблынцы.
Чым гэта боль нясцерпна вымераць? Ён не лягчэй за той, з вайны.
Ці можа край палескі вымерці без аніякае віны?
Няўжо атрутны вецер выпетрыць пачуцці нашы, мову, слых?
Няўжо не вернуцца дазіметры да тых паказчыкаў былых?
Няўжо ў апал плыннай Прыпяці лясы змарнеюць і палі?
Усё стрываем, што не прыйдзецца, каб не застацца без зямлі.
Каб жыта ў полі каласілася.
Каб не радзеў лясоў гушчар.
Каб над планетай не насілася пагроза смерці ў плойме хмар.
Каб катастрофа немагчымаю была.
Каб матухна зямля не ўпала, стаўшы Хірасімаю, з чарнелым яблыкам з галля.